Sure. Does this sound okay?
Yes, does that sound okay?
Do you want to go?
How about now? Is that good? Flip it.
Hello, everyone. If you would find your way to your seats, that would be amazing. Hello, hello. My name is Melanie. I am the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. I see a lot of familiar faces. Hi. How many of you are here for the first time today? Okay, like 5 of you. Great. We love Works in Translation, so please check out our calendar and come back and see us. If you don't know, the Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit whose mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. We do this through public events and partnerships like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. We support early career writers with our First Novel Prize and our Emerging Writing Fellowship. Visit our site and sign up for our mailing list. And to support our work creating a home for readers and writers here in Brooklyn, please consider becoming a member. And come back and see us soon. For example, just point out a couple. We're going to welcome Mariana Enriquez and her translator Megan McDowell here on October 10th. And on October 29th, we will have Brazilian authors Gabriela Burnham and Ananda Lima. So come back and see us. A few logistics after the talks. We'll have a Q&A, so raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so that the people who are watching the live stream can hear you as well. And the authors will be signing after the event in the back of the room. The books are over at the bookstore counter, so you can go get those. All right, and this is the first time that we are participating in the Day of Translation with the Center for the Art of Translation, but it's not our first collaboration with them. We love them. We're thrilled to work with another literary institution working with authors and translators. Literature and translation helps us learn about ourselves and our world, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Michael Holtman, the Executive Director.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Michael Holtman, the director of the San Francisco Center for the Art of Translation. And it's a pleasure to join you today for the 2024 Day of Translation, which promises to be a provocative and memorable day indeed. On behalf of all of us at the Center for the Art of Translation, thank you for joining us at the Center for Fiction. It's wonderful to gather here in a house of stories, as it were. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with CAT, the Center for the Art of Translation is San Francisco's nonprofit that champions literary translation and honors overlooked and underrepresented voices from around the world. CAT believes literature is a vital form of expression and a catalyst for building understanding, sustaining connection, preserving culture, and sharing our common humanity. Our publications, events, and educational programming enrich the library of books available to readers, nurture and promote the work of translators, advance the translation field, inspire community, and honor the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity of our schools and our world. The Day of Translation is inspired in part by International Translation Day, traditionally observed on September 30th, which celebrates the feast of St. Jerome, widely considered the patron saint of translation. International Translation Day was established by the United Nations in 2017 as a tribute to the tireless efforts of translators and interpreters in promoting dialogue, peace, and mutual understanding among individuals from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Our Day of Translation expands on that idea and challenges it a little bit. Today, we'll break away from a single author and her translator discussing a book. In fact, our first panel of the day, Fiction and Translation, explodes that binary. We'll hear from acclaimed translator authors. They'll tell us about the ways in which the art of translation has inspired their fictions and how writing fictions has influenced their artistry as translators. We'll zoom out even further in our panel, Desert Poetics and Translation, where the participating writers and translators will complicate our ideas about language and place, nation, and identity. In our final panel of the day, Typography and Translation, will turn back to the page as a place of discovery and explore how typography can address translation issues such as accessibility, gendered binaries, language preservation, and colonial histories. Our Day of Translation will culminate with a keynote from National Book Award winner Dawn-Mi Che, herself an author-translator whose hybrid work compels us to witness and to resist. It's going to be a tremendous day. As a reminder, today's panels and keynote will be live streamed. Greetings to those of you who are tuning in from afar. And video recordings will be archived and made available for future viewing. Before I introduce our first panel of the day, I want to offer a round of heartfelt thanks. First and foremost, I want to thank the Center for Fiction for hosting us in this lovely space dedicated to literary thinking. and for providing technical expertise, bookish enthusiasm, and good cheer. I want to thank the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz for its innovative public fellowship program. CAT has benefited from working with a tremendous roster of cross-disciplinary readers and thinkers, and this summer we had the great privilege of collaborating with public fellow Ariel Bergdorf, who was instrumental in piecing together two of today's panels. Thank you, Ariel. I think I see you there. I'm also incredibly grateful for today's staggeringly talented participants, a sort of dream team, many of whom have traveled far and wide to be with us today, and several of whom have gone to great lengths to accommodate our schedule. They are amazing. I also want to single out several of my incredible colleagues who are joining us today. Our creative director, Chad Felix, publicist Karen Gu, advancement director Dan Lau, assistant editor Kelsey McFall, and especially public programs director Leslie Ann Woofter, who may or may not be in the room with us, whom we have to thank for bringing everyone together and making today possible. Our inimitable founder and board chair, Olivia Sears, is also here. She's responsible for setting our many endeavors in motion. Finally, the work of the Center for the Art of Translation simply wouldn't be possible without the generosity of our donors, without the provocative work of the writers and translators we celebrate today, and without you, our audience. Thank you. Okay, our first panel of the day, without further ado, is fiction and translation. What is the relationship between translation and creative writing? Is all writing, in fact, a translation of sorts? This panel investigates the connections and boundaries between writing and translating, how one informs the other, and what happens when you do both. Outside of the US, it's not unlikely for fiction writers to also translate, but until recently, this was a rare phenomenon here in the States. This panel brings together acclaimed literary translators who have recently published their own works of fiction to investigate how their backgrounds as translators impact their work as fiction writers. Please welcome Jennifer Croft, Bruna Dantas Lobato, Lily Meyer, and Idra Novi.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. If I'd start you guys off a little easy, and then we can get increasingly philosophical rather than going straight into the philosophical deep end. How's that sound?
Perfect.
You want to tell everyone, let's just, Jenny, start with you and go straight down the line. How being a translator affects the subject of your fiction. And you can't cheat by saying, well, I wrote a novel about translators.
Not the
because
answer.
I know the effects are more than that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of subject, like I wrote, in a roundabout way, my first book is very influenced by my being a translator because I was living in Argentina when I wrote it, and I was really responding to some of the contemporary Argentine novels that I was reading and also translating, and wanting to be an official member of that community as well. So yeah, I guess I wrote like autofiction because that was what I was interested in translating. The rest of it isn't really related to translation. Like, you know, it's kind of inspired by my childhood and my adolescence in Oklahoma, which had nothing to do with languages other than English, etc. But just the format was inspired by my work as a translator, kind of starting to work with Argentine writers. And then my second book is about translators, but that doesn't count.
No, I mean, you did also write a book about translators.
Yeah, I think when that book came out in 2010, I hadn't come across any novels about the sort of ecosystem of literary translation in the US. And so I didn't have any other books by contemporary writers to call on to sort of think about those questions in a meaningful way. But I was talking about them with translators, and then I was talking with people in the fiction world. And so I was just really interested in how this notion of having an author disappear and having a translator go and seek her missing author became kind of a sort of, plot device or plot question for like almost like a laundry line, and then I could hang all of the questions that I had about the relationship between the authors and translators, and then also about the sort of myths about translator-author relationships. I could just kind of, that storyline gave me a place to hang all of the big questions on. So, I mean, I have to say it was very much fundamental to that first book. And in a way, I do think that, like, you know, the narrator of my most recent novel, Take What You Need, she also is a, you know, bilingual editor who works for websites. So I have to say, I think it's very much been integral to all the books. And then, you know, my second novel was also about someone who's moving between, you know, a Spanish-speaking island in the Caribbean and the U.S. and sort of translating the way histories are. So, you know, I think for me, they've been inextricable as a fiction writer.
And Bruna, your novel, which is so wonderful and so very new, treats translation really differently. It's translation as life, I almost want to say. But how do you think of that relationship?
That is beautifully said. I do think of translation as life in that way. I've been living in between my whole life to some extent, and I have a character who, much like me, you know, goes to fancy institutions and speak languages that her parents can't have access to, and who navigates this world of philosophy and literature and, you know, education as an outsider. So she is finding ways to represent herself to other people, and also to be able to still go back home and face her family like, oh, I'm still me. So I think about it in those terms. And language does become a big part of it, just because, you know, to exist is to be in language all the time. So she's constantly trying to find ways to convey, to describe the world that she is now a part of back to her family. And she's like, there is, for example, there's no word for chipmunk in Portuguese. That's something that she notices. She's like, I want to tell you about this creature. And it's so cute. So, you know, finding, but in some ways, that moment with the chipmunk, for example, it's kind of a stand-in for something much bigger, right? Like, there's a lot here that I can't convey, and maybe it will take a whole novel to explain, or maybe it will go beyond that. So that's how I've been thinking about it.
That really speaks to something in your style that stood out to me reading your novel, which is it's very emotional but very, very restrained, which I can only imagine how difficult that restraint was to achieve. And I wonder if being a translator actually either influenced the restraint in your style or taught you how to work with restraint and with the struggles of restraint.
It's interesting because a lot of the writers I work with in Portuguese are not restrained. They're, you know, kind of all over the page and maximalists and have tons of characters and different dialects, and they're switching from place to place, locales, like geographies, like very expansive books sometimes. But I myself, I don't have those instincts as a writer. I feel like all my characters are introspective and trying to narrow down, you know, the chaos of the world, and trying to I guess, zero in on what's central to them in that moment. So it was influential to me, being a translator, in the sense that I got to practice all these different modes of writing and all these different voices, and that gave me a lot of confidence to go back to the page and know exactly what my voice was like, how it was different, what made it my own. But at the same time, I mean, it's hard to know what even came first, because I was working on this novel for so long. I started working on it before I ever tried translating anything. Being a translator kind of came after, as a way to bridge this gap that I felt with Brazil, with this other language that I spoke kind of only in secret, you know, with my parents late at night, kind of when no one else could see it. Yeah, so it feels like being a translator, a literary translator, is just something that I had to do to make sense of my own life. But then again, so was writing. And being a writer made me a better translator, and vice versa. It made me very aware of style, very aware of language. But I feel like that was something that kind of happened organically. It wasn't, you know, I went to translation to seek skills or anything like that.
Hey, I'm very interested in style. I think we'll talk a lot about style. Jennifer, I'm really curious for you about the impact on your style of, I mean, you all translate multiple languages. You translate multiple languages that are very different from each other. different alphabets, different syntax, different. And I'm curious about what that has done to your style in your home language, let's say.
Yeah, like how has that destroyed my brain? Well, I think I really was trying to embrace that chaos, especially in the extinction of Irina Ray. And I feel similarly to Bruna about just, one of the great luxuries of being a translator is that you do get to try on all these different voices, or you get to harmonize with all these different voices. And I'm always like, people always talk about finding their voice as a writer, and it doesn't really feel like that is my project. I feel like there are so many voices, and I really wanted to explore that in the extinction of Irina Ray. So I have, 8 extremely different people who gather together in the wilderness and go wild, basically, and they have to sound really different from one another. And there's there's an unreliable narrator being translated by an unreliable translator. There's no neutral voice at any point in the story. And then I think for the first one, Homesick, which I was writing in Spanish, and then I also started writing in English kind of midway through, I was thinking a lot about how to slightly destabilize English by switching up syntax just a little bit. I wanted to be playful about it rather than forbidding. But I was trying to create a little bit of distance, which I also is kind of built into the plot. So I think just that awareness of other languages at all times is really influential in my style. Sometimes I have to turn it off a little bit, because I think the extinction of Irina Ray gets as detailed as you can possibly, or as I felt I could get about translation. And I could have certainly done more, but I think then that would just continue reducing the audience to myself. So.
Yeah. Oh, I love the translation stuff in it so much. You guys unintentionally sat sort of in order of style. From, Bruna's novel is so characterized by restraint. Irina Ray especially is so characterized by abundance. And I think of your work, Idra, as coming right in the middle, often being it seems spare, and then you have these flashes of poetic language, of extravagant language, of these images that just surprise the hell out of me every time. And I'm curious about, you've been a poetry translator often, and I'm curious about how translation and poetry have impacted your style, and whether those are two different impacts or really the same thing.
Yeah, I think even from a young age, I found it very calming to take a sentence and sort of peel it like an apple into little crisp slices of meaning. That was my way of feeling good. It just made me happy. And I think I'm pretty steady on that front. That is my main unit of pleasure. It's peeling sentences, slicing them up. And I think whether I do that in poetry, or I do it in translation, or I do it in prose, I think that core pleasure, it's that I'm moving on past the apple and the core. I was I'm taking this is the problem, right? I get extravagant, I take a metaphor too far. Yes. So I think that is something that, I think that pleasure seeking of just sort of whatever perfectionist tendencies of seeing a sentence and sort of, chiseling it until you sort of find not only one layer of meaning, but that, there's these sort of allusions to other possible meanings, and that they're all there. Sort of a George Saunders talks about the heightened ambient intelligence of a sentence, and how, he has a whole essay about this, and that really resonated with me, because I think you can't do that for every sentence, right? So whether it's a certain image or it's a certain moment, of heightened, but you are, and I think that I could do that in translation or a poem, where there's kind of a sentence where you do have this heightened ambient intelligence that sort of brings all the other sentences into focus, and sort of, reveals these unsaid meanings in the subtext. And I find those sentences so satisfying. They sometimes take years. But when you finally get it, it's sort of everything clicks into focus. It's you're doing this sort of with your mind on a sentence, where you're zooming out, zooming in, and then when you finally frame the sentence and the syntax is right, and it's so satisfying. So I sort of feel that for me is the same drive regardless of genre.
I'm reading someone right now. I'm deep in a phase, I would say, of someone whose sentences have unbelievable levels of that heightened ambient intelligence, and no one would guess who because it's Robert Caro, who that man is the master, maybe, of.
But so
of
many
the sentence.
sentences.
And there's so many. It's insane, and I think that's why he doesn't get credit for his style, because there's too much. It's too much style, and also every fact about Lyndon Baines Johnson ever. But I have actually been thinking as I try to. This is what I'm doing. I'm spreading my Robert Caro gospel. Trying to convince people to look at his style. I think a lot about how I'm constantly trying to convince people, including myself, that translators also have a style. Our styles are even more invisible, maybe, than Caro's style, which is just, hidden behind a lot of laws. But I'm interested, the question of whether translators get to have style is so live. Bruna, you did a really big nod when I said that, so I wonder if you could start us off talking about translation style, and then everyone can chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't trust a translator who thinks they're actually invisible. I would be very suspicious of that person, because we can't erase our subjectivity like that. Like, in fact, it is our main asset, right? And what we're trying to do is channel it through a voice and find ways to convey it through our own sensibilities. So for me, there is, maybe you can see my style through the selection, right? The kinds of books I choose, the curation. But I do think also in the ways that I can write a sentence, it's the way I can write a sentence. Somebody else will do it differently, and that's a good thing. That's exactly the artistry we're bringing to the table. I do care a lot about precision and things like that, so I'm always polishing a sentence for a long time as well. I like things to feel crystalline and, very clear. That is something I bring to these texts that somebody else might choose to privilege a different facet of the text, but that's the one that I find myself choosing. So I do think I have a very clear style. And I've had people who pointed that out before. They're like, I looked at this book and this other book, and they're 40 years apart in Brazil, but you brought them together, and I kind of see similarities. It's like, I saw that similarity, even if no one else did, and that's what I'm bringing to the table, that's what I can offer. But yeah, I feel like we can't help but be ourselves, even as I am being all characters and, fictionalizing all the time. I am still in my own body, and we write through the body that way.
I definitely think it's true about the body, and I also think when you were talking about Robert Caro, it's really interesting because that doesn't usually come up that much in translation panels. Robert Caro,
it's my agenda.
I love that. Yeah, I love a wild card, as you know. And I think it's like, well, what your touchstone is something that you feel in your body, whose sentences are a touchstone for you. So the last two translations I have done have been collaborations. And it's really revealed to me this question of style, because when you collaborate with another translator or poet, you constantly have to come up with those things that you feel intrinsically in your body, or your touchstones are different. So when I was translating the Iranian poet Garous Abdolmalikian, my co-translator Ahmad Nadalizadeh is from Iran and was doing a PhD, looking at Iranian literature. So his touchstones were closer to the source than mine were, because I was like, these remind me of the parable-like, deceptively simple sentences of Charles Simic. And he was like, they're actually much closer to this in Iranian literature. And I was like, no doubt. But like, those weren't my touchstones, and that wasn't what I brought to the project. And like right now, I'm co-translating, I was just telling Bruna about this, Luis Munoz, who's a Spanish poet from Granada, and I thought that his poems brought to mind Kay Ryan. So when I said to my co-translator, Garth Greenwell, I was like, I think that his like exquisite precision and his use of like only 3 syllables on each line, if they're so pared down, which, I love that, reminded me of what Kay Ryan's poems do. And he hadn't thought of Kay Ryan. And so for me, I think in the art of collaboration, which is its own art, I think it often comes stylistically to touchstones. Like, what is the touchstone? And what are the things that you identify as a stylistic parallel? Because that allows you to articulate the style of the original work, and also to articulate what are your priorities as a translator and recreating those stylistic elements in English. So I find talking about touchstones really helpful for this question of style, because what is it I appreciate about the style of this writer that I want to recreate by thinking about someone else in English who has some stylistic similarities? So I think that's what I do as a translator, especially when I'm collaborating, because you have to say, if I bring up Kay Ryan and my co-translator Garth was like, no, then obviously we're not on the same page in terms of what we want to stylistically make manifest in the translation.
Julie also goes back to what Bruno was saying about
Yeah.
taste as a function of style.
Yes,
because, of
there's
course-
no accounting for taste.
Yeah. What are you thinking?
Yeah, just again about, in the Extinction Never Ran Away, we have so many translators who have such different opinions about this. I mean, I think just like writers don't have the same approach to writing, so obviously translators don't have the same approach to translating, and I think a lot of people do think in terms of, what is the context that would be appropriate in the target language for this person that I'm going to bring into English for the first time. I think there's an unacknowledged politics to every translation. I mean, I completely agree with everything Bruna was saying about, I don't know if I would say that I can't trust a translator who basically doesn't agree with me, but probably I don't trust them. I mean, yeah, like we are who we are. We're in our bodies. We're in our political contexts and social contexts, and that is always going to influence every single micro decision that we're making. As well, like even if we're not thinking of a kind of overarching political project, it's definitely underlying everything. So yeah, I don't know if all of my translations, I don't know if like we gave everyone unlabeled translations, if they would be able to kind of reassign them to each of us. I don't think that my style is so, it's obviously not supposed to overwhelm the style of the other author that I am collaborating with as a translator, but it's certainly there.
Yeah, I was going to ask about political projects later, but now we're here, so I think I might as well ask about them. You've been a very political translator in the sense that you've really been an advocate publicly for translators in an amazing way. And I'm curious for you, but for everyone, whether you feel that your political commitments or responsibilities or projects change when you're your translator self versus your fiction writer self, or whether they're two expressions of the exact same political philosophy.
I think it's the same thing. I mean, basically what I have been asking for is just, not just, but mostly like transparency in cultural production and in general. But, I think for so many reasons it's really essential that we put translators' names where readers can see them. Part of that is because the translator chose every single word that you're going to be reading, and they deserve that credit. Part of it is the translator has to take responsibility for those decisions. If there are terrible things that happen in the translation, people need to know who's responsible for that as well. Part of that is to foreground the identity of the translator as a human being, because I think, obviously our field has been primarily white people who study a language in school for a long time, and I think that fortunately is finally changing. But the more we foreground the translators' names and faces and identities, the easier that's going to be, and the more people are going to kind of call out for that. I think it's essential that we not allow readers to assume that writers who are very proud of writing, for example, in Polish, are actually writing in English. I don't want people, Olga Tokarczuk does not want people thinking she's an American writer. And that has been happening for such a long time. There are so many, especially like very successful, like Murakami. I guarantee you, if I bring in Murakami to my students, they will assume that he's an American writer. And if that isn't marked clearly, sometimes it's not even marked on the title page. But I think my greatest ally I have found in kind of making these requests or demands, my greatest allies have been writers. So it seems like writers are very eager to share this credit and this responsibility, and it's really just sort of old ideas in the world of publishing and maybe academia that are preventing it from fully happening. But yeah, I don't think that I'm asking for anything different as a writer than as a translator.
And you write so much about power, and I mean, we have talked separately about Take What You Need, but that book is so responsive to the way Trump wielded power, and hopefully we can keep that wielded in the past tense.
Indeed, Lily.
Yes.
Thank you.
But I wonder if you feel more of a difference because your fiction has been so intensely about power.
I mean, I have become increasingly convinced that that is where I want to talk about political realities and look at them in meaningful, sort of deep ways, because I think I've seen that there are ways that people can make a brand out of shouting on Twitter and shouting in other places about things, but that's ultimately self-serving and it's more polarizing and it doesn't actually create change. And those same people in person may not have the integrity that they perform online. And so I think seeing a lot of that, there's like an element of that I think there's a lot of building mistrust of that as a form of political activism, but then are those people actually enacting those values in their own work and in their relationships? Doesn't always add up. So I have seen that as something that I mistrust and question. And so I was like, well, what are other ways that you can do it? Who are you giving time to? What are you doing quietly when there's no public praise for your political acts? When you're trying to take a risk in your work that you don't see being taken, but feels really urgent. And I think if we don't talk about polarization in our literary discourse, how will we ever talk about it in our civic discourse? And if we're not able, I think sort of, this us-them thinking of these are the people who are screwing up the country. We're all living in it. We're all in the soup. So I not like I'm trying to do like some sort of literature of self-recrimination, but I just think that there's ways that we all have these hypocrisies. And so if you're not in the thing of sort of like finger pointing and you're sitting with it quietly at home and you're going to think about it deeply and bravely in the quiet of your room, what questions come up that wouldn't otherwise? And I think that's become increasingly important to me, both as a poet, as a translator, and as a novelist. And something that came up with Take What You Need with that is related to translation, and I didn't even realize this, was that there's a deep listening that happens with translation, right? You have to really listen. And I think that act of listening has served me as a writer too. And just listening to what's happening, I do think translation has made me able to listen longer and deeper to sort of what other people are saying or even what my characters are saying. And I think I grew up speaking, sort of like in a part of Northern Appalachia where you just don't see that dialect represented anywhere in fiction. And I didn't even think I was doing this, but I was very carefully trying to get the voices to sort of recreate the humor and sort of the coping mechanisms in conversation that I hadn't read anywhere. And I think someone then started, a couple people when I was on tour for Take What You Need, and it started in a poem where I was just trying to capture these voices, and the listening that I was doing when I was home, I recorded people and I listened to them the way I listened to Clarice Lispector, or I listened to recordings of Manuel de Barros. And so I was using my translator listening skills for political purposes, which is what am I missing? And what are we as a country missing in hearing the understory of how people speak to each other? And I don't think I would have approached fiction that way without translating.
Understory, I like that. Bruna, you're in this moment that I was in very recently. My novel came out not that long ago, and I had this sort of scary realization not that long before it came out where I thought, oh God, I wrote a novel about American intervention in Chile and how we paid for all these terrible things. And now we're paying for all of these terrible things in Gaza, and I'm gonna go on a book tour and I'm gonna talk about it, and I have to, and that is so scary. I wish that I had translated someone's book about Americans paying for bad things so that I would have someone not physically there with me, but spiritually there with me. I was like, oh God, I wrote the book. I have to do it by myself. And I'm just curious, now I'm asking you this scary question, but I'm curious about how you're thinking about going out in the world with your first book with only you.
Yeah, it is very scary. And I think it is related to all the politics that we've been talking about. Maybe one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about the fact that none of us have any neutrality is because anywhere I walk into a room, my body is already political, right? Oh, I'm a Latino body. There you go. I have an accent. People use that against me all the time. I'm used to hearing anybody, professors, publishers, you name it, saying, oh, you can't translate or you can't write. There's no way you can. they don't trust my difference, but I'm supposed to believe them when they tell me their lives are not marked by their experiences, their bodies are not inflected by their experiences. So I can't believe that. And now I have to go around with a little sign, that is already defensive, though I would rather not. But I do feel that way, like very protective of heritage speakers who are translators. And I think there should be more room for translators who are heritage speakers. And I feel protective also of immigrant writers and ESL writers like me, which, also there aren't enough of. So, oh yeah, I'm all kinds of scared. And and as I'm planning the book tour now, I had one event organizer who was like, "Oh, should we do a Q&A?" I'm like, "Oh, I love Q&As." And then she was like, I'll just add one thing, which is that I will not be able to control what kinds of questions we get or who's going to be in the room. And I was like, no Q&A, no Q&A anymore. Because it happens all the time. Like I will talk about, immigration, and then there will be someone in the audience who's like, no one's talking about immigration from Canada. I'm like, no shit. So I do feel like my body is on the line, but it's a good kind of scary maybe, we all are, really, even if we don't want to admit it. We're all going through some kind of risk, and it's good to take risks on the page. It's kind of one of the safest places to do it, at least for this particular subject matter. There are certainly other topics that are riskier, but yeah, I'm looking forward to it, to being like, yes, I am an ESL writer. What gives? You want money or something? I don't know. Yeah, and I used to hope that there would be one day where I would transcend those labels. Like, oh, one day when I'm a big shot writer, none of that will matter. But now I know better. I know there will never be a time when my labels don't hold me back. Doesn't matter how many degrees you have, how many accolades. Like, people will always kind of hold you to that or use that against you or, rub it in. Now knowing that, I'm just more prepared to talk back, maybe.
You want to maybe walk us back to the page, to a different kind of scariness, maybe. So I guess you were talking about collaboration, Idra, which is the different lonelinesses of translation and of writing fiction. There's a bit in Ways to Disappear, where Emma, the translator, wishes that she'd been born a man in Babylon, where translators had been celebrated as the makers of new language, which, there's probably a lot of reasons to wish she'd been born a man in Babylon. But
Sounded like a better time.
I read that partly as a lonely wish. Emma wants to be celebrated. She wants attention. And I often think myself of translation as less lonely because there's another, as I was saying before, there's another writer out there somewhere. But I'm curious about whether that's true for you all as well, or whether maybe, Jenny, for you, writing a book as populous as your second book was less lonely than translating.
Yeah, I feel like definitely my first book, which is very restrained and almost claustrophobic at some points, was such a different experience than writing the second one. And obviously I always knew that this wasn't true, but at many points I felt like my characters had become real people, and I was really having a great time with them. And they were just, as I said before, going wild, and I was enjoying every second of their misadventures. So I did feel like that was, and also, again, going back to the transparency in the publishing industry in general, there's so many people who are involved in the making of a book. I have a really wonderful agent that I'm in contact with kind of constantly. So she was always present in the writing of that book, and an incredible editor who's also a novelist himself named Daniel O'Dell. Check out his novel, Hades, Argentina, if you haven't. Yeah, so I've actually found it to be a much less lonely than I had anticipated, having focused on translation, which I do experience as just being always so collaborative. Whether you're, actually talking to the author regularly or not, they're still present in your mind. So yeah, I've been less lonely lately.
Good.
I have a question for you, Lily, about Short War, and
Yes.
also how many reviews you write and are, because I think of reviews in some ways similar as like you do have to articulate your aesthetics, you have to think about style, what you think makes for a compelling book to read, and similar like when you're choosing what book to translate, so you do a lot of reviewing and translating and writing your own novel. So I'm wondering if you could just weigh in on these questions for yourself, because how does your work sort of like articulating what makes for a compelling book impact the choices you make as a translator and the book you chose to write?
Oh, well, I was writing Short War for so long. I think I made every wrong choice with Short War, as my lovely agent knows. And certainly, both reviewing and translating helped me understand those wrong choices and helped me see my aesthetics clearly, and more than anything else, in that they helped me understand my own attraction to cleanness on the page, I want to say. My attraction to anything with a hole or a gap. Like, I really, something I love in your book, for example, is how much of the story happens in the footnotes, basically. Like, I love when there's any kind of disjuncture between what you expect from a story and what a story is. And I realized that more than anything through writing reviews, I think, because I kept noticing, I'm praising the same stuff. And I'm turning down assignments always for the same reason, which is that I think a book is too straightforward and there aren't any of those holes. Or if I think the prose is messy, those are the two reasons that I won't review a book if I get asked to review it. And in that, that my mind is very populous, because I do all of these things. Like, I'm never intellectually lonely because my brain is so crowded. But yeah, I think that crowding really helped me, I think, to write my book. I think that's true.
I think if you haven't read Short War, you should definitely get a copy. It is fantastic, and it is very chiseled in that way. Like, I think the dialogue and the scenes, you feel it has that sense of having lived with the book and its deeper meanings for a long time.
I do wonder now if I sat on some of those sentences too much. But it was 10 years of sitting on them.
Well, they're ready.
10 years as well. Oh gosh. Yeah.
I would high five you if you were closer to me. Your book is so much about loneliness, actually. Reading it was the reason I thought, I need to ask about the loneliness of the fiction writer, because it's so intense in parts of your book.
I know. It is about loneliness. It is about the loneliness of, being the only person in your family to go to college, and also about being maybe one of the very few people of color or international students at a college in Vermont, and about being a writer and a thinker, and also about digital intimacy, right? And how we try to connect, and then we only feel our loneliness even more acutely after a phone call or something like that. I think I am kind of a profoundly lonely person. I've always been, like, I maybe prefer that way, right? I'm always just sitting with a book and thinking, and then I'm like, gosh, I'm so lonely, I wonder why. I've always been that way, but sometimes, I find a lot of comfort in community, like with the translation community or with the writing community. But then I've also found myself often in places where I have no community whatsoever, and I feel really cut off from the world. So the book is touching on that. But yeah, it's become, thankfully, harder and harder to feel lonely as the more, I spend time in the industry, and the more other writers I meet, other translators. So I feel like the translation community is so friendly and so welcoming, even if there are corners of it that are less so, but usually I just avoid those. And the writing community felt harder to break into. It took me much longer, like so much so that a lot of people seem to think that I was always a translator first and then I pivoted to writing, and I was like, oh no, it just took me much longer to break in. No one would open the doors, Yeah, so there is a loneliness to writing that I also sometimes feel in translation, especially when I am translating an author who's no longer living. I've often just sat there and be like, I wonder, and no answers will come back to me. I'm looking at a friend who translates many a dead author now. Maybe you would know, maybe you feel similarly. But I feel like I can also just always ask a friend, what do you think this line means? Or what is the kind of truth you get from this. Whereas with my own brain, with my own writing, no one's gonna give me the easy answers. Not my agent, though I've tried, not my editor, none of them. The book won't write itself, none of them will write the book for me. I just had to really sit there for a long time. It felt like it would never end. And I didn't know if I could get through the years of just sitting there torturing myself, but I did. You did, and I did.
We did.
And it feels amazing. But then also now, because it was so private for so long, extra scary, I guess, to circle back to the fact that now other people know the contents of my head. That's very strange. Yeah.
Yes. As a critic, it's my job to say what something means, and as a translator, it is kind of also our job to say what something means. But I often think that being a fiction writer is just sitting and going, "Oh my God, what does this mean?"
I know. And what is it that I deep down that I'm feeling, or that I want to say, or what is it that sometimes I feel like I'm scraping the surface to get to the other thing, the next thing. I have to write through slush, right, to get to this deeper meaning, and I won't know. And sometimes I'll surprise myself, or then I will switch directions halfway through the book, right? It's full of discoveries like that. And I go very excitedly, I go to my partner and I'm like, so this is what it's about, and it's in my head, and he's like, I have no idea what you're on about. And people want to understand, but yeah, no one will ever know what the experience of writing the book is like. That in itself is really isolating, because it was like a decade of my life, a third of my life.
Yeah, same. My suspicion, just as a reader, is that this is even truer with poetry. And Idra has a new poetry collection, which it's beautiful because it's beautiful, but also it's very physically beautiful. It has all this amazing art in it, which I recommend that everyone go see. But what's in the hierarchy of what does it mean? Where is poetry for you? Is it even more intense on that front?
I mean, I think poetry is my secret sauce. I stir it into everything. I just think that's what I go back to. It's like it's my first ingredient for all things, And whether I'm writing, poetry or translation or fiction, I'm like, what would George Oppen do here? I just think something about his however and yet, his caveats or something. There's certain poets I read at at a fundamental younger, when I was just in formative years, where certain voices are just there, and so I think that is what I go back to. That's just the first ingredient, whatever I'm stirring up. And I do love collaborations, and I think I value them more as I've gotten older, because just don't get out as much. I have dogs and children and people. There's just a lot of people who depend on me. I have a lot of dependents, and so it's nice to have something else that's a different kind of conversation. I really cherish it and value that. So Erica Baum, we worked together. I did a series of epistolary poems addressed to Clarice Lispector, and it came out in a chapbook. And Erica's art, she has this text-based art called These Dog Ears, where she sort of folds text over and sees what language happens. So her text-based art really appealed to me. So we did this chapbook together a number of years ago. And those poems that I wrote to Clarice, that series never came out anywhere. It wasn't available anywhere. And then I was writing about other people, some poems back to Manuel de Barros and de Paulo Henrique Brito, and other people that I was translating, and alongside this deep listening I was trying to do to sort of hear the voices where I grew up that I had never heard in fiction, or heard in a way that didn't seem like they were being villainized or flattened. And whatever, there was this disaster field that happened with J.D. Vance, and he just made everything worse. So I felt increasingly compelled to sort of humanize these voices that I saw repeatedly dehumanized, which I think is something that both translation and fiction can do. But doing that in poetry was so satisfying. And so then in the pandemic, I collaborated with Eric again on another series. And so those two collaborations in the art and the text, that back and forth, did feel like we were doing a little bit of a translation of each other. I would write a prose poem, she would translate it into a collage-based work of art, then I would write a poem back to her, uses of imagery. And I just found that it was it started getting me thinking about ekphrastic poems. And I wrote, one of the poems in this book is about Ana Mendieta's art, and another one, So then I was just thinking about how ekphrastic poetry, writing back to work of visual art, is another form of translation, which felt new and novel, because I could bring my translation instincts and do something new with them, of sort of how can you take your response to a work of art or sculpture and translate that into language. I just like anytime you can sort of take your translation tool set and do something new with it, it's like you get to inhabit your novice mind, but you also get to bring this thing that you know brings you joy and do both. You know, and I think that's kind of a neat thing, that once you have translation tools, you can bring them to anything. And I think that that novice mind, when you are like, I'm new at this, I can make mistakes, it feels exciting, but you also can bring some of those things where you just have that comparative way of thinking, where you're leaping between one kind of seeing and hearing and doing it somewhere else. I love whenever translation becomes a way of doing something new. And I think that's always true for poetry.
I'm conscious. I think this is a nice room and a trustworthy room. And so I want to give the people in this room a chance to ask your own questions. But you have sort of gone right to the question that Michael asked in his introduction, which is the scariest question of all. And I want to at least give us a chance to look at it, which is everything actually translation? And if it isn't, do you miss translation when you're doing things, literary things that aren't? What was that head shake?
Oh, I was just looking to see if anybody else wanted to start. It wasn't it. Is everything translation? In a way, yes. In a way, no. Yeah, I mean everything. I don't know if I have an answer to that question. I don't miss translation when I'm not doing it, but I'm usually doing it, and I guess that might be why. Yeah, everything is translation or everything's not translation. One of those two is probably the case.
Both things, maybe.
My son brought home a magnet from some like bag of prizes at school, and the magnet, he says, "This is a gift from you, Mommy," and the magnet said, "I'm silently correcting your grammar." I put it on the fridge because it's true, and I think that magnet is like the translator thing. Like, you're just a syntax-seeking person, and yeah, I do. Like, I will read things and be like, "That was mistranslated." Like, I can't not silently correct the grammar of everything I read. Like, when I read a sloppy book and people resort to cliches, I have hives, and I in my mind I was like, no, you cannot rely on this cliche. It's not. It's sloppy. So I mean, I see that, and I just my mind immediately corrects not only grammar but like reliance on cliched language. I do have a physical reaction to it, so I can't stop translating. It's almost like a compulsion. Yeah.
Alternatively, everything is book criticism, which is my failing in life. Maybe.
I mean, I feel like it's really hard for me to separate being a translator from me personally, given, my background, being a translator from being a foreigner or someone who lives in between worlds. So for me, everything is translation. Like, I just spent yesterday 35 minutes explaining to my mom why I prefer an electric toothbrush, and she's like, that is an utterly inane thing to have an opinion on. And I was like, I know, and I'm trying to explain to her, like, orthodontics in America is a thing. Like, to me, everyone here has perfect teeth, mother. Just there's so much that I'm constantly trying to figure out and understand, and things that maybe other people take for granted. Like, everyone knows what this thing is or why this thing is a standard, but I am constantly comparing, and I know things not to be true. I'm, of course, we all are aware of language and the fact that everything in language is a feature of the language and that other languages are completely different. So I do feel like I am constantly kind of going back and forth, or like there's something in my brain that is trying to find a place to settle and to be in, but it's constantly kind of being pushed back and forth. So maybe in that sense, everything is translation for me. But sometimes also I get this feeling that things are not in translation, or that things don't need to be translated. Not everything, certainly not everything needs to be translated. Some things can just be where they are in their corner. And I think a lot about my mom's indigenous background. I very rarely talk about that or write it. I've never written about it. I don't translate it. It's hers to keep. So I don't know. So yes and no. I feel like it depends. I do think I have the impulse to translate or to put into language things that, in general, that I experience, even when they resist that. But maybe I should question it on occasion. Very unsatisfactory answer. Maybe is what.
Perfect note to open up to audience Q&A on. We have a little bit of time if anyone wants. And if you could just, if we could start right there, if you could just project to the
Oh, there's
oh
a
no, no,
microphone.
even better, even better.
So I'm a translator from Brazil, and I came to the US to do a master's in publishing. And 10 years ago, I wrote my thesis about books and translation in the US. And the one thing that was like most remarkable is that readers don't like reading foreign authors. And so like what Jennifer was saying, that it's important for the readers to know that the writer is a foreigner. I think it's like the publisher's dream for them not to know they are, and for the book to be successful because of that. So how do you think what you're saying is important to conciliate with like the market and what the publishers want?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't experienced that, so I haven't looked at the data and how it's shifted. It certainly seems to have changed in recent years, according to studies in the UK that have come out recently, that people are really, especially younger people, are really excited to read about, to read stories that are from other cultures or other contexts or other languages. So I'm not sure. I mean, there are a lot of newer publishers, smaller publishers like the Center for the Art of Translation that really specialize in specifically translation, or indie publishers that publish a lot of translation. And those seem to be doing really well for the most part. So I'm not sure. I don't believe that it's not commercially viable at all. I was told for so long that Olga Tokarczuk would never appeal to American readers by every editor I approached for really 10 years. And that isn't actually the case. So I guess it's kind of a question of chicken versus egg. Do people mistrust translation because they are intentionally misled by publishers sometimes? And that could certainly be the case. Do people still mistrust translation at all? I don't know. I think.
And is it worth tricking the reader into reading this
No.
book by pretending it's not a foreign book? I don't know that I want that reader, or that I want to get readers that way, right?
Definitely.
On that note, I actually just want to say too, I feel like it's especially bad with kids publishing. I remember finding out that these books that I had read as a kid were written by a German woman, and that was so not part of the. I don't think you could have found that anywhere, but it was such a I found this out as an adult. But anyway, that's not my question. I guess so. I'm just curious, more specifically, because I feel like so much of as a translator, the interesting things that I'm doing happen when I'm revising. So I'm kind of curious, how this writer-translator dynamic has influenced the way you edit yourself.
Yeah.
But maybe also how your experiences of being edited have differed when you're publishing your own work versus publishing a translation.
That's a great question. Anyone on? Really funny, with Ways to Disappear, it was translated into Portuguese so that the speakers that in my head, I was imagining them in English speaking in Portuguese. So I was thinking about the humor in the innuendos of people speaking in Portuguese and writing them in English. And then my Portuguese translator was translating them back into the language that I had translated them in my head in English originally. So it's an interesting reverberation. And actually, I was he really got it, which was very satisfying to read. But then when I had French translators or German translators translating that book, they couldn't, because I was replicating conversations I imagined happening in Portuguese, and obviously they didn't replicate as succinctly, or didn't map onto it as easily in Italian or French or the German translations, because that sense of humor was different. But I think because I was a translator, I know that you have to approximate. You have to find something that rings true for the humor of that language and that reading public. So I think I just was more understanding, and I was just very open to their creative solutions and the way that they were trying to do something that rang true for them as a speaker of that language. And I think I also bring that to anyone doing the invisible work of publishing and of translation, because I've done lots of invisible work. You know, like this work that, I mean, it's not invisible to anyone who's doing it or to any of you, but to the rest of the world, because the translator isn't, you know, mentioned. So that you're doing it for the love of literature and words and language and these things that bring you great pleasure and meaning. You're not doing it for applause, because you're not going to get any. So that's not going to motivate you for long. You have to find some other motivation. So I think that that helps me. Like just thinking about Olivia's work all these years, and Michael's work, and Leslie Ann's work, and all of you who do translation, and I see that with my copy editor for my novels. I see that with my editor. I see that with everyone involved in making books happen, because I know how uncelebrated those aspects of that sort of behind the scenes work is, and how crucial it is. I think it's made me more appreciative of thinking of all the people who contribute to the life of a book. And they appreciate that I see that, because I think if you're an author and you've always been the big name on the book, and there's lots of people doing things for you all the time, you've never been the one who's contributing that under-acknowledged work. And I think it's made me more appreciative, and I think I'm better able to collaborate with editors and translators as a result.
Oh, I don't know that I have anything to say other than I am a very obsessive writer and translator. I edit a lot, and I read everything out loud multiple times, and I print it out, and I have a red pen, and I read it out loud and again, and do it again, and annotate it, and print it out again. And I do that a lot. And I like to turn in a translation when I've obsessed over it for plenty of time, and I know that, I might wake up in the middle of the night nervous about a sentence, but maybe less constantly. And I'm like, okay, I can more or less rest. It helps me, I think, but it also makes my writing very polished and restrained and all of that. I think I have an anxious personality. It's just, I am who I am, right? So, I usually don't do the messy draft and then come back to edit. I can't even do that. It's a terrible way to work. Don't do it. But it's the only way I know how, is that I only move to the next sentence when I am at least minimally satisfied with the previous one. It's like very obsessive kind of work. It's worked out so far, but I don't know that it's a model other than it's just the way I've always done it.
Mm-hmm. Just in terms of my experience of being edited, I think it's so much more subtle and potentially fraught and complex to edit a translation. And I keep thinking about Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salesses and the excellent ideas about appreciating literary structures that are not from like the MFA Anglophone world, that are not from like the commercial American tradition. And I think there can be such a temptation, especially for fiction, for editors and translators alike, to improve on the original. And you can use the excuse that the American reader might, or the UK reader might be expecting that, or might like it better. Or, I mean, the real reason is, of course, like that it might sell better. But it was much easier to, like, my editor completely destroyed my most recent novel, The Extinction of Irina Ray, and we had to like do it all over again. Totally fine to do that, and we both shared like the same vision for it and the same goals for it, and it just, it's really hard, I think, to edit a translation in an ethical way.
The thing I would add quickly is just that translation is such a reminder, doing it mainly, that the words can always be different. You could always have chosen another synonym. You could always have done the syntax a different way. Mm-hmm. I'm so much less precious about my writing because I know that from translating. I always am rephrasing. And I see that we have a question up front here. Yeah. The mic is coming.
Thank you. And all of you has talked about the similarities between translation and fiction writing or creative writing. I wonder if you could talk about the difference or the leap you make from translation, which is almost a research project, to the creating of a story from nothing. Okay, thank you.
So the question is sort of with translation, you're working with something. It's not a blank page, right? So your job as a translator is to figure out what it is you want to recreate in English. But there is something on the page. You have to do the cultural translation, the linguistic translation, the stylistic translation. There's all these things, but you're not working, with a blank. You're working with something and trying to bring it to life and ferry it into a new language and a new version, right? Whereas with a creative act, it is from a blank page, right? It's creating something, so that is the difference. I think, with poems, it's sort of like, oh, well, whatever you're going to create, it's probably going to go on for like a page and a half. I mean, you may work on it for a long time, but the scope is quite different. And I think I think with narrative, it can be sort of story-driven, whereas in a poem, it can be more like sensory-driven or voice-driven or image-driven, so there's like something else that you're starting with on the page, like the one moment that you want to crystallize in all of its aspects. But I guess I bring that to fiction anyway. Like I definitely write scene by scene. My units for fiction are one unit of meaning is a sentence, or it's like one image or one scene or one sensation, and then that's my building blocks, and I build from there. So in some ways, it doesn't feel that different from what you would do in a translation, because your units would be, this sentence really knocks my socks off. It's so fascinating to me, and I want to share this incredible sentence with a reader in English. So that's still, the goal isn't actually that different in a way, and like, I speak Spanish at home. I've been, married to a Chilean for 27 years. It's a really long time. Makes me sound quite old, but we started young, our bilingual life. And I think that all the time I'm translating. It's just like what I do in my household. And in many ways, the electronic toothbrush thing, I relate to that. Because yes, nobody in South America uses electronic toothbrushes. It's baffling. And
well, why would they?
Well,
You know what I mean?
Very
Like,
calming. It's like a mouth massage. I have also had this conversation that really made me laugh when you said that, because I was like, I have had this conversation. I mean, many things like that come up. Like I was just thinking of the Brazilian concept of saudades, like the Portuguese concept of saudades, and then Romanian, there's this concept of dor, which is very similar, sort of like kind of bodily yearning that can't ever really be resolved. So there can be moments where there's something that you can't translate, you have to let it be, right? But then you can also in another language find a way that it also isn't exactly the same, but a lot of languages have a word like that. So it's very satisfying to find them, if you've lived it and have learned to accept that the saudades is just such a rich concept. Right? And you can't really make it work in English with one word. You just can't.
I'm also thinking that with fiction, sometimes I have less of a place to hide. I can't be like, for example, I guess going back to the fact that we might have a style, a lot of the books I translate are queer books. That is clearly something that I'm interested in, I'm drawn to, and there's a pattern there. But then I am hiding behind the fact that there are these authors that I think are, under-translated, and I want to, bring a spotlight to them and all of that. And I am just in the back, like pushing them towards, the stage. But then with my own writing, when I talk about something very vulnerable or about, living in a body and all the things that come with that, I am exposing something, my own thinking, my own sensibilities, my own concerns a lot more. And that always makes me really nervous. I'm thinking, how, I guess, reserved I am with my own writing. I don't even like to share it with my agent until I've put 5 years into it or something. I hold on to it as much as I can because I feel terribly exposed. I'm like, everyone will know my fears, everyone will know my anxieties, and everyone does know my fears and anxieties through translation as well. Because it's pretty clear. At one point, it becomes clear. But I have all these smoke and mirrors and all of that I can go pretend this is only mildly about me. Yeah, but yeah. So maybe there is something there that I am revealing. The mind at work is at work on both kinds of books, but it's maybe more immediately apparent in fiction in a way that makes me really nervous. I'm not normally performative. Like I would rather. Just being, no one needs to know anything. And then yet, I'm on a stage right now. It's one of these things that, I've always appreciated that with translation, I can engage with language and engage with minds and do that in a way that feels just, that it comes out of genuine curiosity and I can leave the other things out the door. That's one of my favorite things about it. And with fiction, I often lose that side of it.
I know we're almost at time, but Jenny, I want you to get to
That
answer
was so
too.
beautiful. I feel like we should end on that.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Lily.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, everyone.
One more round of applause for our writers and translators. Yes. Please read their books. Please read their translations. Just before everyone stands up, relaxes, stretches, I want to remind you that we'll be taking a short break, but we'll be back at 1:45 for our next panel. Please get a snack, and we're so happy you're here. Thank you.